October 24, 1942. 11:47 p.m. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The rain fell in sheets so thick it seemed solid, a vertical ocean that turned foxholes into mud pits and transformed the jungle darkness into something beyond black. A wet, breathing void that swallowed sound and sight equally. Private First Class Mitchell Page lay in a position that could barely be called a foxhole. More a scraped depression in the volcanic soil of a ridge that had no name on any map but would be marked in blood before dawn. His Browning automatic rifle, the bar, 20 pounds of walnut and steel, rested across sandbags that were dissolving in the rain. The weapon was supposed to be dry. Nothing on Guadalcanal stayed dry. Through the deluge came a sound that didn't belong to the jungle or the storm. Metal clicking against metal, the distinctive noise of equipment carried by men trying to move quietly and failing. Page pressed his cheek against the bar's stock, felt the water running down his neck, and waited. At 11:51 p.m., the ridge erupted. Guadalcanal in October 1942 was where the American counteroffensive in the Pacific went to test whether it would survive or collapse. The island itself was strategically minor, a malarial speck in the Solomon chain that most Americans couldn't locate on a map, but it had an airfield, and that airfield had become the fulcrum on which the entire Pacific campaign balanced. Henderson Field, named for a pilot killed at Midway, was the only operational American airbase between Hawaii and Australia capable of projecting power against Japanese shipping lanes. If it fell, the Japanese could resume their advance toward Australia, could cut supply lines, could transform the Coral Sea into an imperial lake. If it held, American forces had a platform from which to begin the long, bloody island-hopping campaign that might, eventually, reach Tokyo. Everything depended on a strip of grated coral and the exhausted, diseased, undernourished Marines who defended it. The Japanese High Command understood the stakes with crystalline clarity. They had committed increasing forces to retaking Henderson Field throughout September and October, sending regiment after regiment into the jungle to assault the American perimeter. Each attack had been repulsed, but each attack had also whittled down the Marine garrison, reducing combat effectiveness through casualties, exhaustion, and tropical disease. By late October, the 1st Marine Division was operating at roughly 60% strength. Replacements arrived slowly. Supplies arrived irregularly. Medical evacuations were limited by the availability of transport aircraft and the constant threat of Japanese air attack. The men holding the perimeter were running on willpower and the institutional memory of Paris Island drill instructors who had convinced them that Marines didn't retreat. The Japanese soldiers moving through the rain toward Page's position that night expected to encounter the same exhausted, depleted American forces they had been grinding down for weeks. They expected resistance. Marines were known to be stubborn, but they expected that resistance to crumble under sustained pressure from fresh troops with superior numbers. The 29th Infantry Regiment, specifically chosen for this assault, had been held in reserve, had been fed adequately by the standards of Japanese logistics, had been briefed that this attack would be the decisive one. Intelligence reports suggested the American line was stretched thin, that certain sectors were held by skeleton crews, that a concentrated assault at the right point could break through to Henderson Field and render the entire American position untenable. They expected to push through light resistance, overwhelm exhausted defenders, and claim victory by dawn. They expected the night to belong to them, as it had belonged to Japanese forces throughout the Pacific campaign. What they encountered instead was Private First Class Mitchell Page and a Browning automatic rifle that refused to stop firing. The bar was an anomaly in American small arms development, a weapon designed during World War I that somehow remained relevant in World War II despite being too heavy to be a rifle and too light to be a true machine gun. It fired the same .30-06 cartridge as the M1 Garand, fed from a 20-round magazine, and could deliver sustained automatic fire at a rate of around 550 rounds per minute. In theory. In practice, the weapon overheated quickly, jammed in muddy conditions, and required constant maintenance. It was also, in the hands of a skilled operator, the most effective squad automatic weapon available to American infantry. The Marines had recognized this before the Army did, incorporating bar tactics into their doctrine and training operators to think of the weapon not as an automatic rifle but as a portable base of fire. Mitchell Page had trained on the bar at Camp Elliott in California, had carried it through the landings at Guadalcanal in August, had learned its quirks and compensations through 2 months of jungle patrols and perimeter defense. He knew that the weapon's 20-round magazine meant you burned through ammunition at a terrifying rate during sustained fire. He knew that the bipod mounting was fragile and unreliable. He knew that in the humid hell of the South Pacific, the weapon's tendency to overheat became critical after about 3 magazines fired in quick succession. He also knew that when Japanese infantry were charging your position in darkness, none of those limitations mattered as much as the simple fact that you could put a lot of bullets into a small space very quickly. At 11:51 p.m., as the first wave of Japanese infantry emerged from the jungle trailing 50 yards from Page's foxhole, he opened fire. The bar's distinctive cyclic rate, slower than a machine gun, faster than controlled rifle fire, created a sound that would become seared into the memories of everyone who survived that night. Not the sharp crack of individual shots, but a rolling thunder of overlapping reports that suggested firepower far exceeding 1 man and 1 weapon. Tracer rounds, every 5th round in his belt was a phosphorescent marker, drew lines of fire through the rain, revealing targets and creating the illusion of multiple firing positions. The first wave faltered, went to ground, began trying to locate the source of fire. Page changed magazines, adjusted his aim, and fired again. Historical records from the Marine Corps archives document that the initial Japanese assault on Page's section of the ridge involved approximately 40 soldiers from the 29th Infantry Regiment's lead company. They advanced in a standard infantry assault formation, loose dispersal to minimize casualties from artillery, close enough to maintain unit cohesion in darkness. They expected to encounter scattered rifle fire from dug-in Marines and had been trained to close quickly, to use grenades and bayonets at close range where American firepower advantages were minimized. What they received instead was sustained automatic fire from a single position that seemed to have unlimited ammunition and no concern for barrel overheating or malfunction. The fire didn't stop. It adjusted, tracked, followed them as they moved. It created a kill zone that extended from the jungle edge to within 20 yards of Page's foxhole, a space where movement meant death and staying still meant waiting to die. The emotional and psychological impact of this situation on the attacking Japanese infantry cannot be understated. They had been told they were facing a depleted, exhausted garrison. They had been told that American automatic weapons were unreliable in jungle conditions. They had been told that aggressive assault tactics would carry the position. Now, caught in a kill zone created by a single weapon that violated all those assumptions, they faced a choice that had no good answer. Advance into fire that was cutting down everyone who moved, or retreat and face the consequences of failing in an attack that was supposed to be decisive. Japanese military culture in 1942 provided clear guidance on this question. Advance. Always advance. Death in attack was honorable. Retreat was unthinkable. So they advanced, and the bar kept firing, and men kept dying in the mud and rain of a ridge that would never be important for any reason except that Mitchell Page held it. At approximately 12:04 a.m., 13 minutes into the engagement, Page's bar jammed. The bolt locked back on an empty magazine that had been inserted slightly misaligned, creating a feeding malfunction that would require several seconds to clear. In those seconds, Japanese infantry covered 15 yards, close enough that grenades began landing near Page's position. He cleared the malfunction with the mechanical precision that 2 months of jungle combat had drilled into muscle memory, slammed a fresh magazine into place, and resumed firing. The advancing Japanese soldiers, who had interpreted the pause as a sign the weapon was finally disabled, suddenly found themselves caught in the open at close range. 7 men went down in as many seconds. The advance stopped. Page adjusted fire, sweeping the killing zone, denying movement to anyone still visible. Behind him, other Marines in the platoon's defensive positions began firing, but their rifle shots were sporadic, limited by ammunition concerns and the simple reality that they couldn't see targets in the darkness and rain. Page's tracers marked targets. His sustained fire forced enemy infantry to reveal themselves by muzzle flash. He had become, inadvertently, not just a firing position but a targeting system for the entire defensive sector. The symbolic object that emerged from this engagement, that would come to represent American material superiority in the minds of Japanese soldiers who survived it, was not the bar itself but the magazines. Specifically, the number of them. Page had entered the engagement with 12 20-round magazines in his immediate possession and access to several hundred more rounds of loose ammunition in bandoliers. When he ran low, other Marines crawled through the mud to bring him additional magazines stripped from the weapons of casualties. The Japanese soldiers attacking the ridge carried approximately 120 rounds of rifle ammunition per man, 6 stripper clips of 20 rounds each. When their ammunition was exhausted, there was no resupply. When American magazines ran empty, more appeared. This disparity, this fundamental inequality in the logistics of killing, defined the material reality of the Pacific War more clearly than any strategic assessment or production statistic. One side could sustain fire, the other couldn't. One side's supply lines stretched back to functioning ports and factories. The other's supply lines were being systematically severed by American submarines and air power. By 12:15 a.m., the initial Japanese assault had been broken. Casualties littered the approach to Page's position. Exact numbers would never be determined, as bodies were dragged away during subsequent lulls in the fighting, and the attacking force had pulled back to the jungle tree-line to regroup. Standard Japanese doctrine called for immediate renewed assault after reorganization. The regiment's officers, monitoring the attack from command posts several hundred yards behind the line, could hear the distinctive sound of the bar and understood that a single automatic weapon was creating a problem entirely disproportionate to its tactical significance. The solution was obvious. Concentrate fire on that position, neutralize it with grenades or mortar fire, then resume the assault. The problem was that concentrating fire required knowing exactly where the position was, and Page had learned to fire in bursts from slightly different angles, creating the impression of multiple firing positions. The tracers that marked his fire also blinded anyone trying to pinpoint his location. He had turned the bar's visual signature from a liability into a form of tactical deception. At 12:23 a.m., the second wave came. Larger this time, perhaps 60 men, drawn from reserves that were supposed to be held for exploiting the breakthrough once the ridge was taken. They advanced more cautiously, using the terrain more effectively, trying to suppress Page's position with coordinated rifle fire before closing for the final assault. Page waited until they were committed, until they had moved into the killing zone and couldn't retreat without exposing themselves, then opened fire. The bar had cooled slightly during the lull. He burned through 4 magazines in what felt like seconds, creating overlapping fields of fire that caught the assault at its most vulnerable moment. Men fell, sought cover, returned fire wildly at muzzle flashes they couldn't precisely locate. The Marines on either side of Page's position added their fire, creating a defensive network that appeared far stronger than its actual strength, which was approximately 15 men holding a position designed for a reinforced platoon. Japanese after-action reports, captured later in the campaign and translated by American intelligence, described the assault on Henderson Field's perimeter the night of October 24 to 25, 1942, as encountering unexpectedly heavy resistance from automatic weapons. The phrasing is bureaucratic, designed to explain failure without explicitly admitting defeat, but it captures the essential reality. They expected light resistance from exhausted troops with limited ammunition. They encountered sustained automatic fire from positions that seemed to have unlimited ammunition and no intention of yielding. The reports don't mention Mitchell Page by name. Individual American defenders were rarely identified in Japanese documentation, but they describe a specific sector of the ridge where concentrated automatic fire prevented the advance of 2 full companies despite repeated assault attempts. 2 full companies, approximately 180 men, stopped by a defensive position held by fewer than 20 Marines, anchored by 1 man with 1 Browning automatic rifle. The transformation that occurred in Japanese tactical thinking during engagements like this one was gradual but ultimately decisive. Early in the Pacific War, Japanese infantry doctrine emphasized aggressive assault tactics, night fighting, and the psychological impact of sustained offensive pressure. These tactics had worked at Singapore, in the Philippines, across the Dutch East Indies. They were predicated on facing British, Dutch, or colonial forces with inferior equipment, limited combat experience, and brittle morale. When applied against American Marines dug into defensive positions with adequate automatic weapons and functioning supply lines, the same tactics produced catastrophic casualties for minimal gain. But doctrine changes slowly, especially in militaries built on traditions of offensive warfare and warrior spirit. So the assaults continued wave after wave, trying to overwhelm positions that could sustain defensive fire longer than attackers could sustain offensive pressure. At 12:41 a.m., Page's bar overheated to the point where the barrel began to glow faintly red, visible even through the rain. He stopped firing, let the weapon cool, used the pause to reorganize ammunition and check his position. Around him, other Marines were running low on ammunition, some down to their last clips. The Japanese forces in the jungle were clearly preparing for another assault. Voices carried through the rain, officers rallying troops, equipment being moved forward. If they came again with the same numbers, if they concentrated their assault on this weakened sector, the line would break. Not because the Marines would retreat wasn't in their training, but because you can't hold a position with empty rifles against determined infantry assault. Page understood this with the clarity of a man who had been in combat long enough to calculate odds without conscious thought. He had perhaps 3 magazines remaining in his immediate vicinity. Another 4 magazines scattered among the other positions, but retrieving them would mean leaving his foxhole. The bar was cooling but would need several more minutes before it could safely sustain extended fire again. At 12:47 a.m., the third wave emerged from the jungle. This time they didn't advance in a coordinated line. They came in small groups using fire and movement tactics, trying to get close enough for grenade range before the automatic weapon could engage effectively. Page let them close, let them commit, then opened fire with his remaining magazines. The bar cycled through its ammunition at the same relentless pace, but now he was rationing bursts, firing only when he had clear targets, making every round count in a way he hadn't needed to earlier. The Japanese infantry got closer than before, some to within 15 yards of the Marine positions. Grenades began landing with increasing accuracy. One exploded close enough to Page's foxhole that shrapnel tore through his pack and wounded a Marine in an adjacent position. He changed magazines, fired again, emptied it, reached for another and found nothing. This was the moment when the single automatic weapon that had held a ridge against 3 waves of assault over nearly an hour finally ran out of ammunition and the Japanese breakthrough could proceed. This was when tactical physics reasserted itself and 40 Japanese infantry, now reduced to perhaps 25 effectives, but still numerically superior to the defenders, would overrun a position held by Marines with empty weapons and no remaining options. This was when American material superiority became meaningless because you can't shoot bullets you don't have. Mitchell Page picked up the bar, fixed its bipod, and began moving forward out of his foxhole toward the Japanese positions. What happened in the next 6 minutes would be debated by military historians for decades afterward. Not the facts, which were documented by multiple witnesses and confirmed by physical evidence, but the reasoning. Why would a Marine with an empty automatic weapon advance toward numerically superior enemy forces? The official citation for Page's Medal of Honor, awarded in 1943, describes his actions as fearlessly continuing forward and maintaining an aggressive defense. These phrases are accurate but sanitized. What Page actually did was something far more primal and tactically unsound. He carried a 20-pound empty weapon toward enemy soldiers who were preparing to overrun his position, and he used it as a club. But the weapon wasn't entirely empty. In the chaos of the third assault, other Marines had begun stripping magazines from casualties, both American and Japanese weapons, and some of these had found their way to Page's position. He had perhaps 40 rounds scattered across 3 partial magazines. Not enough for sustained fire. Enough for psychological effect. He advanced 10 yards, dropped behind a slight rise in the ridge that provided minimal cover, loaded one of the partial magazines, and fired a burst toward the Japanese infantry who were now reorganizing for what they expected to be the final assault against a position that had stopped shooting. The bar's distinctive sound, that rolling thunder that had defined the engagement for the past hour, erupted again from a position 15 yards forward of where it had been. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. The Japanese infantry, who had convinced themselves that the automatic weapon was finally disabled, now believed they were facing a counterattack by a defender who seemed to have unlimited ammunition and no concept of defensive positioning. Page advanced again, firing short bursts, moving before return fire could locate him precisely, creating the impression of multiple automatic weapons coordinating an assault. Behind him, the remaining Marines in the defensive positions began firing again, adding their rifles to what sounded like a coordinated counterattack by a reinforced unit rather than the desperate last stand of an understrength platoon. The Japanese assault wavered, stopped, began to pull back toward the jungle. Page followed, still firing partial magazines, still advancing, still creating the acoustic signature of an aggressive defense that had no business existing given the tactical reality of his situation. Historical analysis of this moment struggles with the gap between rational military decision-making and what actually occurred. By all reasonable tactical assessment, Page should have conserved his remaining ammunition, maintained his defensive position, and held as long as possible before inevitable overrun. Instead, he advanced into a situation where he was outnumbered roughly 10-1 with a weapon that had perhaps 30 rounds remaining. The decision was either brilliantly intuitive, recognizing that the psychological impact of aggressive action would outweigh the tactical disadvantage of position, or completely insane. The result was the same either way. The Japanese assault broke. Units that had sustained heavy casualties trying to take the ridge for the past hour withdrew rather than face what appeared to be a counterattack by forces that should have been exhausted and defeated. By 12:53 a.m., the ridge was quiet except for the rain. Page returned to his original position, found 2 more partial magazines that other Marines had scrounged, and waited for the next assault. It never came. The Japanese regiment, having committed its available forces to taking what intelligence had assessed as a lightly defended section of the American perimeter, had lost tactical cohesion and offensive capability. They would probe the ridge again before dawn, would exchange sporadic fire with Marine positions, but the concentrated assault that might have broken through to Henderson Field was over. One section of perimeter, held by fewer than 20 men, anchored by 1 automatic weapon that had somehow continued firing long after it should have been overrun or disabled, had held. The sun rose on October 25, revealing a killing ground that Marine burial details would spend the next 2 days clearing. The official count documented 38 Japanese bodies in the immediate vicinity of Page's position, with blood trails suggesting additional wounded who had been dragged away during the night. The ridge itself was cratered with grenade impacts, littered with spent brass casings, and marked by the distinctive scars of automatic weapons fire. The bar that Mitchell Page had fired throughout the engagement was inspected by armorers and found to have a barrel worn to the point of being unsafe for further use without replacement. The weapon had cycled approximately 1,500 rounds over the course of the engagement, roughly 75 full magazines worth of sustained fire under conditions that should have caused catastrophic malfunction. The recurring symbol that emerged from this engagement, mentioned repeatedly in after-action reports and personal accounts, was the magazines themselves. Japanese soldiers who survived the assault and were captured later in the campaign described their shock at the amount of fire coming from American positions, the sense that the defenders had unlimited ammunition. They were partly right. Page's position had been resupplied during the fight by other Marines who crawled through fire to bring ammunition stripped from casualties. The American supply chain, stretched and improvised as it was on Guadalcanal, still functioned well enough to keep automatic weapons firing. The Japanese supply chain, decimated by submarine attacks and aerial interdiction, could not provide equivalent sustainment. Each magazine that Page loaded represented a logistics chain that extended back through supply dumps, transport aircraft, cargo ships, and ultimately factories in Connecticut where the ammunition was manufactured. Each magazine was proof that America's industrial base, untouched by war, could produce enough to keep 1 Marine firing 1 weapon for an hour straight without pause. The transformation in Japanese tactical assessment after engagements like this was documented in intercepted communications and captured orders throughout the remainder of the Guadalcanal campaign. References to heavy automatic weapons became increasingly common in Japanese intelligence reports, often overestimating the number of bars and machine guns in Marine defensive positions. The actual TONE, Table of Organization and Equipment, for a Marine rifle platoon in 1942 called for 3 bars per platoon, 1 per squad. Japanese intelligence estimates following the October assault routinely calculated 6 to 8 automatic weapons per platoon, based on the volume of fire they had encountered. They were wrong, but their error was tactically significant. They began planning assaults based on the assumption of defensive firepower that didn't exist, which meant they were either overcommitting forces to overwhelm Phantom weapons or avoiding attacks on positions they could have taken with accurate intelligence. Mitchell Page returned to the United States in early 1943 for the Medal of Honor ceremony and a war bond tour that took him across the country. He stood on stages in Philadelphia and Chicago and Los Angeles, wearing his dress uniform with the light blue ribbon at his collar, while local dignitaries described his heroism and audiences applauded. He rarely spoke at these events. Public speaking made him more uncomfortable than combat, but when he did, he emphasized the same point repeatedly. He wasn't alone on that ridge. Other Marines held other positions. Other men brought him ammunition. Other rifles fired when his bar ran empty. He insisted that the medal belonged to his platoon, not to him personally. This was both true and incomplete. Other men had fought on that ridge, but Page was the one who had turned a single automatic weapon into a force multiplier that held a position against odds that should have rendered it indefensible. There's a deeper truth in Page's insistence on shared credit, one that speaks to the nature of American military effectiveness in World War II. Individual heroism mattered. There's no denying that Page's skill with the bar and his decision to advance when tactically he should have withdrawn made the difference between holding and losing that ridge. But individual heroism was enabled by systemic advantages. The bar that Page fired was a superior weapon to anything available to Japanese infantry. The ammunition that kept it firing came from a supply chain that functioned even under the chaotic conditions of Guadalcanal's contested logistics. The training that taught Page to clear malfunctions and maintain fire discipline came from an institutional Marine Corps that had developed automatic weapons doctrine while the Japanese Army still emphasized rifle marksmanship and bayonet charges. The individual achievement was real. The system that made it possible was equally real. Neither alone would have held that ridge. The strategic significance of the engagement was understood by both sides within days. Japanese forces would continue attempting to retake Henderson Field through November, but the assault on October 24th to 25th represented their last realistic opportunity to break the American perimeter when its defenders were at their weakest. The failure of that assault, specifically the failure to break through sectors that intelligence had identified as vulnerable, convinced Japanese high command that the Marines had been reinforced more heavily than was actually the case. They began planning for a larger, more deliberate offensive that would require additional troops and supplies. That offensive would be launched in November and would fail more decisively, leading ultimately to the Japanese decision to evacuate Guadalcanal in February 1943. The chain of causation is clear. Tactical failure in October led to strategic reassessment, led to delayed operations, led to American reinforcement, led to decisive Japanese defeat. And the tactical failure in October hinged on a single ridge held by a single platoon anchored by a single automatic weapon. The Marines who survived Guadalcanal carried the memory of those night battles for the rest of their lives. In reunions decades later, in oral history interviews conducted by the Marine Corps Heritage Foundation, in memoirs published long after the war, they returned again and again to specific sensory details. The sound of the rain, the weight of mud in their foxholes, the distinctive cyclic rate of the bar firing in darkness. The weapon became totemic in their memories, not as an object but as a sound, a rhythm, a promise that someone was still fighting. When you heard the bar, you knew the position was still held. When it went silent, you knew something had gone wrong. And on the night of October 24th to 25th, when it should have gone silent after the first 10 minutes but continued firing for an hour, that sound became proof of something they had been taught but hadn't fully believed. That they could hold against superior numbers if their weapons kept working and their ammunition kept arriving. The bar itself, weapon serial number 95247, was eventually evacuated from Guadalcanal and sent to a rear area depot for rebuild. The worn barrel was replaced, the action was cleaned and inspected, and the weapon was returned to service with a different unit. It survived the war and was eventually surplused in the 1960s. Purchased by a collector who didn't know its history until archival research decades later connected the serial number to Page's Medal of Honor citation. The weapon now resides in a private collection, occasionally displayed at military history conferences, a physical artifact that connected industrial production in Connecticut to tactical success on a muddy ridge 9,000 miles away. But the real legacy of that night wasn't the weapon or the medal or even the strategic significance. It was the proof, demonstrated under the worst possible conditions, that American material advantages could be translated into battlefield success even when those advantages were marginal and the conditions were desperate. Guadalcanal was where the American counteroffensive could have failed, where exhausted, diseased, undernourished Marines held a perimeter that was stretched too thin with supplies that arrived too slowly. It was where the gap between American industrial potential and current combat capability was widest. If the Japanese could break Henderson Field when the defenders were at their weakest, the entire Pacific strategy would need reassessment. They didn't break it. Not at Edson's Ridge in September. Not at the Matanacaw in October. And not at Page's position on October 24th to 25th, where one Marine with one automatic weapon held for just long enough. The epilogue to Mitchell Page's story is quieter than the engagement that defined it. He remained in the Marine Corps after the war, served in Korea, retired as a colonel in 1964. He lived in California, worked in real estate, attended Marine Corps reunions where younger veterans asked him about Guadalcanal. He answered their questions but always deflected personal praise, always redirected credit to the men who had fought alongside him. In 2003, at age 85, he died in a veterans hospital outside San Diego. His obituary in the Marine Corps Gazette was 3 paragraphs long. The headline read, "Medal of Honor recipient, Guadalcanal veteran." It didn't mention the ridge or the bar or the 6 minutes that changed Japanese tactical assessment of American defensive capabilities. It didn't need to. Every Marine who read it knew. There's a particular quality to the memory of automatic weapons fire that veterans recognize instantly and civilians never quite understand. It's not the loudness, artillery is louder, explosions are louder. It's the rhythm, the persistence, the sense that the firing will continue until either the target is destroyed or the ammunition is exhausted. That rhythm communicates intent. It says, "I'm not shooting to suppress you, I'm shooting to kill you, and I'm going to keep shooting until one of us is dead." On October 24th to 25th, 1942, that rhythm communicated something more. That the American forces defending Henderson Field had enough ammunition to sustain fire, enough weapons to maintain pressure, enough logistical depth to continue fighting when by all rights they should have been out of supplies and falling back. The rhythm was tactical. The rhythm was psychological. The rhythm was strategic. And for 1 hour on a rain-soaked ridge, the rhythm was Mitchell Page firing a Browning automatic rifle that refused to quit. The Japanese soldiers who survived that night carried their own memories, documented in post-war interviews and memoirs. They described the sound of American automatic weapons with a mixture of respect and incomprehension, respect for the effectiveness of the fire, incomprehension at the apparent endlessness of the ammunition. One account, translated from a memoir published in Japan in 1968, describes the assault on Henderson Field's perimeter as encountering walls of fire from automatic weapons that never ceased. The author, a lieutenant who had led one of the assault waves, noted that his training had taught him that automatic weapons were vulnerable. They overheated, they jammed, they ran out of ammunition quickly. The American weapons did none of these things. They fired and fired and fired again. "We were taught that spirit overcomes material," he wrote. But how does spirit overcome bullets that never stop coming? The question was rhetorical but strategically profound. Japanese military doctrine in World War II emphasized morale, training, and warrior spirit as force multipliers that could overcome material disadvantages. The doctrine wasn't entirely wrong. Motivation and unit cohesion matter in combat. But there's a limit to what morale can achieve against sustained automatic weapons fire backed by functioning logistics. The Japanese discovered that limit at Guadalcanal, rediscovered it at Tarawa, rediscovered it again at Saipan and Peleliu and Iwo Jima. Each time, the lesson was the same. American forces could sustain fire longer, could replace casualties faster, could bring material advantages to bear more effectively than Japanese tactical doctrine could counter. The war became a race between Japanese adaptation and American production. Production won. The symbolic weight of the magazines, those 20-round metal boxes that kept arriving in Page's foxhole throughout the engagement, extended beyond their immediate tactical function. Each magazine represented a supply chain that started in American factories and terminated in a muddy foxhole 9,000 miles away. Each magazine was proof that the American industrial base could produce enough not just for survival but for sustained offensive fire. The contrast with Japanese logistics was stark and, ultimately, decisive. Japanese soldiers in the Pacific Theater were often reduced to subsistence-level supplies by late 1942. Rice rations shrank. Ammunition became precious. Medical supplies ran out. Meanwhile, American forces on Guadalcanal were eating hot meals, receiving regular resupply flights, and firing automatic weapons at rates that would have been considered wasteful by Japanese standards. The inequality wasn't just material, it was philosophical. One military doctrine was built on efficiency and conservation because resources were limited. The other was built on overwhelming firepower because resources, while not unlimited, were abundant enough that conservation wasn't the primary concern. Mitchell Page's decision to advance with his bar when tactical logic suggested he should retreat or hold position has been analyzed by military historians and leadership instructors for decades. The Marine Corps uses the engagement as a case study in aggressive defense and initiative at the small unit level. The specific question addressed is, when does aggressive action create strategic effects disproportionate to its tactical risk? The answer is complex and situation-dependent, but Page's example suggests that aggression succeeds when it exploits enemy psychology as much as enemy positioning. The Japanese infantry assaulting the ridge had sustained heavy casualties, had been stopped repeatedly by fire they couldn't effectively suppress, and were psychologically primed to interpret any unexpected action as evidence of American strength they hadn't accounted for. Page's advance, objectively risky and potentially suicidal, succeeded because it confirmed enemy fears that they were facing a stronger, better supplied force than intelligence had suggested. There's a final symbolic element worth noting. The sound of the bar itself, that distinctive cyclic rate that became the acoustic signature of American firepower in the Pacific. Japanese veterans interviewed decades after the war could still describe it precisely. Slower than a machine gun, faster than rifle fire, with a rhythm that seemed deliberate rather than panicked. That sound became associated with American positions, with American defenses, with the specific character of combat against Marine units. When Japanese forces heard that sound, they knew they were facing troops with automatic weapons and, by extension, with the logistics to keep those weapons firing. The sound carried information beyond its immediate tactical meaning. It communicated industrial capacity, logistical depth, and national commitment to producing enough weapons and ammunition to sustain combat at levels Japanese forces couldn't match. October 24, 1942, began with rain and darkness and ended with rain and darkness, the tropical climate indifferent to human struggle. But between those identical conditions, something had changed. A ridge with no name had been held by Marines with minimal strength against forces that should have overrun them. One automatic weapon had fired for an hour under conditions that should have disabled it. One operator had advanced when tactical logic suggested retreat. And the Japanese assault that was supposed to break through to Henderson Field had been stopped, redirected, ultimately defeated. The strategic consequences of that tactical success would unfold over the following months, but the lesson was immediately clear to anyone who had witnessed it. American material advantages, however marginal in the chaos of Guadalcanal's contested supply lines, could be decisive when applied by troops trained to exploit them and willing to hold positions that seemed untenable. The truth that emerged from that night on the ridge was neither simple nor comfortable. It wasn't a story of inevitable American victory through overwhelming force. The forces weren't overwhelming, the victory wasn't inevitable, and the outcome balanced on decisions made by exhausted men in conditions of incomplete information and constant danger. It was a story of marginal advantages compounding into tactical success, of individual initiative exploiting systemic strengths, of one weapon firing just long enough to hold one position that turned out to matter strategically. The bar that Mitchell Page fired through rain and darkness for 60 minutes of sustained combat represented everything that American industrial democracy could produce when properly motivated. Weapons that worked, ammunition that arrived, and troops trained well enough to employ both effectively even when the odds suggested defeat. The magazines kept coming. The weapon kept firing. The ridge was held. And somewhere in the darkness, Japanese commanders were revising their estimates of American defensive capabilities, adding phantom weapons to their intelligence assessments, planning future operations based on the belief that what they had encountered was systematic American superiority rather than one Marine with one bar who refused to stop shooting. They were wrong about the specifics. They were right about the trend. American material advantages would grow throughout the war, would become more systematic, would eventually render Japanese tactical skill and warrior spirit insufficient to contest the outcome. But in October 1942, those advantages were still potential rather than actual, still dependent on individual weapons staying functional and individual operators knowing how to use them. The future was arriving, but it hadn't fully arrived yet. It was still being fired one magazine at a time from a muddy foxhole on a ridge that would never be famous but would always be remembered by the men who held it. The rain kept falling. The magazines kept loading. The bar kept firing. And the night, which should have belonged to the attackers, belonged instead to one Marine who turned a defensive weapon into an offensive statement, who held a position that tactics said was indefensible, who changed Japanese strategic assessment with 60 minutes of sustained automatic fire backed by a supply chain that stretched back to a country that could produce enough bullets to keep one man shooting for an hour without pause. That was the truth of American abundance. That was the reality of industrial democracy at war. That was the sound of the future, cyclic and persistent and ultimately unstoppable, firing through darkness until dawn finally came.